Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. It is another Tuesday, another episode, another interview, and I hope that you are doing well. It's the middle of June already. That means that we are dang near halfway through this year. I don't even know. I hope you had a good weekend. My weekend was spent between working on a huge project that I'm trying to get done and battling a migraine. So not maybe the best weekend, but there were some good stuff. There were some good elements in there. One of the good parts of the weekend was this interview. So that's always nice. As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, I am speaking today with author Bethany Mangle about her debut novel, Prepped. This is a young adult novel about growing up in a doomsday community. And let me just read you the back of the book. First of all, on the front of the book, it says, "There's no survival guide for falling in love." And then when you flip it over, it says, "Always be ready for the worst day of your life." This is the mantra that Becca Aldane has grown up with. Her family are doomsday preppers, part of a neighborhood that prioritizes survivalist training over trips to the mall or senior prom. They're even arranging Becca's marriage with Roy Kang, the only eligible boy in their community. Roy is so enthusiastic about prepping that Becca doesn't have the heart to tell him she's planning to leave as soon as she gets a full ride to a college far, far away. Then an accident rocks Becca's family and pushes the entire community deeper into the doomsday ideology. With her getaway plans in jeopardy, the only person Becca can turn to is Roy, who reveals that he's not nearly as clueless as he pretends to be. When Roy proposes they run away together, Becca will have to risk everything for a chance to hope for the best instead of planning for the worst. And so, it also says, for fans of Jeff Zentner and Katie Henry comes a thrilling and funny debut about a teen raised in a doomsday community who plots her escape with the boy from the bunker next door. I know about preppers. I actually have some friends who are preppers in some way. They've never told me a lot about their personal prepping preferences. That was a lot of P's, but they're open about it. They talk about the fact that they do have some prepping tendencies, but I hadn't thought into this level of that lifestyle before. I guess I thought of it more as kind of like individual families as opposed to this community. This is a whole neighborhood of preppers. They live in community. They're even arranging marriages. Becca is third generation preppers. Her both sets of her grandparents were founding members of this community, and so it was very interesting to see the extent that this community goes through to be prepared for anything, and that is their mantra. They're not just being prepared for the zombie apocalypse, which sometimes I think when we think about prepping, we think about The Walking Dead or those kinds of shows, and they are really trying to prepare for anything. Invasion, kidnapping, murder, I don't even know, just anything you can think of, anything bad that could happen, they are trying to be prepared for. Earthquakes, doesn't matter that they live nowhere near a fault line. Earthquakes, tsunamis, flooding, and really, really interesting. And Becca as the character is just not wanting to be involved anymore. She wants to be a normal teenager. She wants to go to college. She does not want to have an arranged marriage and be forced into the career that the community deems fit for her. Career being kind of a loose term, but it's it's a fascinating concept, and the book is it's a really quick, good read. There's humor, there's wow, this is crazy moments, all those good things. So let's go ahead now and turn to the interview. Again, the book is called Prepped. The author is Bethany Mangle.
Hi, Bethany. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
I am happy to have you on, and I'm excited to talk to you about your new young adult novel. It's called Prepped. Before we get to the novel, though, if you could start by sharing a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you a bit, that would be great.
Okay, yeah, I'm pretty boring. I basically just read a lot and hang out with my dogs. I'm 29 years old. I live in Mississippi, and I've just been really passionate about writing my whole life, so that kind of just absorbs everything for me.
I think you're the first person who started that answer with "I'm pretty boring," but you do have a book published, so you can't be too boring. Let's talk about Prepped. Can you share the premise of the story?
Sure. So you would think, like, after writing a book that I would be able to summarize it in any sort of reasonable way, but I always find that to be the most difficult. So I'm going to steal a line from my amazing publisher who did it for me. So Prepped is really about a girl who's raised in a doomsday prepping community, and she plots her escape with the boy from the bunker next door.
Yeah, yes, he is the boy from the bunker next door. I do like that description. So yeah, they are in Ohio. They are in a doomsday community. Not only that, but she is third generation prepper, which I found interesting. I guess I'd never really thought about it before. I know people who have kind of this mentality, but I didn't realize there were communities or that there were generations of people. So what was your initial inspiration for the story?
Well, I work in nuclear power, and as you can imagine, there are a lot of safety rules and emergency management rules. So I was watching a drill at work and thinking, like, what would it be like if you had to be prepared for everything all the time, but in your personal life? And I'm talking about things that, like, don't even make sense, like, the ability to get a tsunami off of a lake, like the most fantastical, outlandish things possible. And if you took that mentality and then applied it to just your everyday routine life, what would that be like?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting because I think when I think about doomsday or things like that, the things that come to mind are like apocalyptic movies that generally have some sort of a virus involved, and it turns into The Walking Dead or whatever. But this group is really trying to prepare for everything, which is impossible. But wow, yeah, talk about being prepared. The main character is Becca. Can you talk a little bit about her and what you think will resonate with readers with her character?
Yeah, so I mean, all of my characters have a little bit of me in them, but Becca is really in response to kind of the protagonist I wanted to see when I was younger, when I was in the young adult reader kind of age group, which is I wanted to see an imperfect person who has a lot of flaws, that a lot of the books that I read growing up had these heroes who were so moral and so strong, and you never saw them like fumbling or just, and I felt like a disaster area. So I wanted to kind of show this character who is really flawed and confused about what she wants, who does the wrong thing, who makes the immoral choices sometimes, and bends the rules and is not really sure about anything except for kind of her end goal, and is figuring out how to get there along the way. So that's really the basis of where Becca came from when I was drafting this.
Actually, I really like what you just said, because oftentimes when I read young adult, I try to put myself into the position of I'm 14, 16, 18, whatever age, and thinking, as a 15-year-old, how would I have responded to the situation? Not like that. and I like that the Becca she's not a normal 18-year-old, of course, because of how she grew up, but she's a normal 18-year-old. She doesn't quite know what she's doing. She's trying to figure
and that's
things out
the point.
Yeah, and she is trying to figure things out with no family support, because even on a good day, her parents aren't really parents. So yeah, I liked that about her.
Let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. But if you have been listening to this podcast for a while, you've probably heard me talk about or project myself into young adult books before. Not my current self, but my 15-year-old self, or whatever age the main character of the book is. And like I said, that's something I really appreciate about Becca, is that she's a regular kid. She doesn't have any magical powers. This isn't a fantasy book. Although she's got way more skills than I do, because she grew up in a prepper community. But she doesn't have all the answers. She's just trying to figure things out as she goes along, and I appreciate about that. She's strong, she's flawed, she's relatable, all that good stuff. Stay tuned. When we come back, Bethany will be talking about the types of research she did for the book. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with author Bethany Mangle about her debut novel, Prepped. Let's go ahead and return to the interview.
I am both frightened and really intrigued to ask this next question, but what types of research did you do for the book?
Okay, so I went down so many completely unrelated rabbit holes that I didn't need to. I would be researching something totally ridiculous for 45 minutes and then realize it had nothing to do with Prepped. I was just hitting you're reading this article, do you want to read this one? And then I would end up on something totally unrelated. So most of my research, I do have to credit to my husband, which I don't know if you've seen The Big Bang Theory, but I basically compare him to Sheldon Cooper. So if I have a question about anything technical, like how would it be possible to power an underground bunker, he can just rattle off the answer off the top of his head. So we joke that we're two different kinds of nerds, because I'm very bookish and he's very about his engineering things like bridges and trains, and so that was very helpful, having someone to bounce ideas off of. But then I also was just looking up, like accident statistics, like what things are the most probable that would stick out in someone's head, what is like the most ludicrous thing that could possibly happen. And then I just kind of sprinkle those references in, like talking about, seismic rated picture hooks and things like that normally you wouldn't even conceive of if you weren't like on a fault line. So a lot of it was also just like very minor things in addition to like the very heavy research.
Yeah, but I bet you learned some really fascinating things that you may or may not ever need to know, but you do know them now. That's kind of cool in some ways.
I mean, I will admit that some of the research did seem a little more like relevant once the pandemic started.
Yeah, I bet. Yes. I also was kind of thinking, I wonder how this group would be in the pandemic. I was trying to sort of project myself into their thought process on that one. In terms of character development, do you like to flesh out your characters before you start writing and have a really solid idea of them, or do the characters come to you kind of as you're writing? How does that work for you?
I don't outline at all. I usually get an idea that is a single scene in my mind that I see really, really clearly. And from that point, I will write another big scene. And so I'll write chapter 2, chapter 9, 14, and 27. And then I just start filling in all of the things in between. So I'm really building events and pieces as I go along, and that includes the characters. Like I have an idea of who they are, but sometimes I see an opportunity to really like, oh, okay, I can go into their motivations here. And while I want all of my characters to have their own personalities and their own hopes and dreams and everything, I also sort of don't want to flesh them out too much, because I feel like, again, going back to when I was a teenager, I was still figuring out myself and my own identity, and that's something that I want to show in all of my characters, that they might not be the most like three-dimensional people, because I wasn't a complete and whole person at 15, 17. And so I also want there to be questions about who they are, because they are still questioning who they are.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How about Becca's younger sister, Katie? She is she's a secondary character, but she's really important, and she's kind of one of my favorites because she's so quirky and mercurial. Where was the inspiration for that relationship grounded?
That actually came from my mom. I was really struggling with getting the story to flow right, and I said, I feel like there needs to be like an anchor for Becca in this community. I just can't figure out what it is. And my mom said, well, why don't you give her a younger sibling? And I'm like, oh, that's perfect. And I don't have a younger sibling. I only have an older brother. But I kind of thought back to, the dynamic that you have with any sibling where, you kind of want to look out for each other. And you're not always similar to each other, but you're still in the same family. You still have a lot of shared experiences, but you can go in different directions. And that was kind of where Katie came from, the idea of having Becca kind of explore her community through what's happening to her sister, and kind of this desire to like herd her sister in the right direction, and what happens when that doesn't work out so great.
I love that your mom said, why don't you give her a sibling? Often when moms say that, it has a much different connotation when they tell their daughter, why don't you give her a sibling? I don't know if this is easier or harder than that, but you mentioned that that all your characters tend to have a little bit of you in them, but are there other autobiographical elements within your writing?
Yeah, I think so. And really, like with Prepped, a lot of that came from, my professional background, and things like that, being able to kind of sprinkle in topics that I'm familiar with. And it took me a long time to realize that write what you know doesn't have to be the situation. It can be an emotion, it can be a friendship or a feeling. And even when I don't intend for it to be that way, there are little things like the dog in Prepped. My dog is such an important part of my life, and just some of the little habits that she has, I realize I've based off of my dog. Or like Miss Garcia, the physics teacher, is kind of a nod to my physics teacher in high school. And kind of a mashup, I would say, of like the personality of my chemistry teacher with some of the habits of my physics teacher, and that part was intentional. But I like to draw these little like tidbits because it helps me picture them in my mind and make them like kind of fully formed concepts. I don't think like that I'm really inventing anything new. It's all based somewhere at some point.
How about Roy? Does he have? Is there a specific person that you kind of had in mind when you were thinking about his character?
Yes and no. I mean, with Roy, he is a little bit just like of my heart. I love him so much, but it's also that feeling of having someone who you can depend on at all times. And so that's a little bit from like my own marriage, where I feel like my husband has just put up with me even when I am so ridiculous, and has almost been too good to be true sometimes. But just the idea that you can carry each other like through chaos, even when you're both kind of just flailing and you don't know what to do, because we really went into like adulthood together, and we're trying to figure out our lives and get everything settled together. And so I really liked that idea of giving Becca a relationship that wasn't brand new, that they had a long history together, and seeing what they could do with that.
One detail that you included that it was perfect and horrible and amazing all at the same time, because the community was so excited when Roy's family moved in because they're Korean and they would diversify the gene pool for repopulating the earth. And I mean, it's completely accurate, but at the same time, you're like, oh my gosh, who are these people?
I'm still going to ask, who are these people? We're going to take a break, and you can contemplate who are these people. But actually, I mean, if you come at it from a strictly practical point of view, you do want to have the most diversified gene pool possible. So having someone of a different ethnicity move in would be ideal, I guess. Wow, yeah. Thanks, Mom and Dad, for not deciding that I needed to marry the boy from the bunker next door because he would provide a good, diverse gene pool. Let's go ahead and take that break. When we come back, more with Bethany Mangle. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I hope over the break you took some time to figure out who in your immediate neighborhood would be the best person to match up your kids with in terms of genetic diversity. It's very important to think about these things. Let's go ahead and return now to the interview with Bethany Mangle.
What about young adult, the young adult genre, do you think it is that draws you to writing within that genre?
I joke it's because I have never grown up. Like I was born 80 years old, according to my parents, but at the same time, I feel like I'm still a little kid. I'm very excited about the things that I enjoy doing, and I'm not going to be embarrassed about them. And kind of, I kept that, like, I guess, childlike enthusiasm for certain things. So I feel like I'm connected in a way to that age group, but I also am just drawn to, I feel like when you're in that age group, you're not as like inhibited about things. I feel like you experience things very intensely when you're in that age group, and that's why I write like for older teens specifically, because I remember being that age and just feeling everything so much, and the pressure of the future and of what I was going to do and who I was going to be. And I really feel like there's so many different things that can be done with that search, basically, for where you're going to end up and how am I going to get there. And I don't know that there's really any other time, at least in my life so far, that I felt that uncertain, basically, about everything.
Mhm. Yeah, it's definitely a complicated and interesting time in life for sure. What are you working on now? Do you have a new project going?
Yeah, so I have a couple of things. I normally can't figure out what I actually want to pursue until I start writing it. My second book that's coming out next year, that one's already done, but, we're still working on kind of getting that out. And that one's like a little bit more fun. It's about, a girl who gets picked with her mom for like a dating show where it's like a build your own family. So it's, they have a suitor come on with their kid, and they're all kind of stuck together in this house, and they're trying to choose kind of a new family. It's for divorced single parents. So that one was a little bit more like fun with some dark undertones. And then some of the projects that I'm looking into now, I'm just trying to really figure out exactly if they're going to work out, the direction I want to go. And that's kind of the problem with not outlining, is sometimes I'll get halfway through a project and I have absolutely no idea what is going on. I just have to let it sit for maybe, 6 months or a year until one day I'll have an epiphany and go, okay, I can finish this. Or it just kind of goes into this very sad folder of like projects that are 10% done because I realized, later that I just did not have enough of an idea to really move forward with it.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Just kind of, it's like the writing equivalent of painting yourself into a corner, maybe. How has it been?
Yeah, a little.
Oh. How has it been? I find it, I don't know if ironic is the right word, but the fact that you wrote a book called Prepped and it came out during a pandemic. There was absolutely no way you could predict that. But how has it been for you to release your debut novel in the midst of a pandemic?
It was really hard. I do appreciate the irony of it, and I always go back to this one comment that my editor made on this manuscript, before the pandemic happened. There is one point where they are talking about how they have these different lights that they use in case there's an emergency, and one is for epidemics. And my editor commented, "Oh, how clever." And that comment probably aged poorly, but yeah, it was a little surreal, and I have had people ask me if my inspiration was the pandemic, and that's like this was done way before that. But then having it come out, I was just in such kind of a weird space after like quarantine and, being an essential worker and being away from home for a while, during the beginning of the pandemic and everything. That was really stressful. And then the book came out. So it was a lot of kind of being really frazzled and running around, but also screaming with happiness because like I had my book out finally. So I will just say it was a very irregular experience, and I am looking forward to having another book come out just so that I can kind of see how it's supposed to happen when it doesn't feel like the world is ending.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be a different experience for sure. You mentioned earlier that writing is kind of something you've always been drawn to. So is it something that you've always wanted to do? What made you decide to start writing for publication?
I started to write stories before I knew how to write actual words. So my grandmother would write them for me, and then I would draw pictures on like construction paper or whatever. And none of the stories made any sense, but I just love to tell stories. And I would say that like we were just lucky because, my brother knew exactly what he wanted to do from a very young age and what he wanted to pursue, through our teenage and our high school years. And I kind of had the same thing where we both had these very particular passions about what we wanted to do. And so I decided that I was going to pursue publication probably when I was around 12, which is when I started being able to write something of any length, which continues to be a problem. I'm like a chronic underwriter, and then I have to like really flesh things out. So I then got into the quest for a literary agent, which took me, I got my first request for a manuscript from an agent when I was 13. I did not actually sign a contract with an agent until I was 26. So it was a very long journey. And I joke because my first full request was sent out on a floppy disk. And that's how long it took to get to the point that I thought, okay, I think I might actually one day get to the end goal here. I might actually be able to sell a book and get it on a shelf.
So from your particular journey, then, would you have advice for other aspiring authors?
That's always such a hard question because I feel like people are in such like different circumstances. And I guess that like my advice would just be that you have to be kind to yourself. There were so many times on that journey that I was like the worst to myself, where I would, delete entire projects that I had worked on for months because I was so frustrated and felt like a failure, like it was never going to happen. Or I would criticize every little thing and never have the courage to send out, a manuscript or a story or something like that. And so that's really my advice, is that, you have to love what you do and you have to love your own, skill set, because that's what keeps you going. It's not a matter of like, oh no, just don't give up. It's don't give up on yourself no matter what happens. Like even if there's a rejection or 100 rejections, it's not a reflection on your work as long as you love it. And that's something that took me a long time to understand.
On that very, very good advice, we are going to take our final break of the podcast. Before we go to break, though, I was just thinking, this is a while back, right after the second break, when Bethany was talking about research and how she would get sucked down these rabbit holes, and then she would ask her husband, and he would just have these answers. I'm thinking if I ever need to do research, my husband would come in very handy because he doesn't sleep well. And so he ends up watching what could be seen as the most random documentaries in the middle of the night. And he has a brain full of the most interesting, most random facts that you could ever encounter. And so I think I need to utilize him. And I don't know what the book would be about, but there would be some interesting facts in that book. Let's go ahead and take the final break of the podcast. I will be right back. Pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets podcast is for you. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Bethany Mangle.
When you take the time to read for yourself, not for research or something else, who are your favorite authors, genres, etc.?
I kind of bounce around, and I know that's maybe a little odd. I become like briefly obsessed with a certain type of book. So during the pandemic, I was not very creative, and I just could not get into fiction at all. And so I was going towards this really like dry, like nonfiction about really anything, any topic that I could find that just kind of caught my eye, as long as it was like very detached and or like technical. But I will bounce around kind of to any genre. I don't really read horror. That's probably the only exception. One of my favorites, obviously, since I like write in that category, is, young adult contemporary. And I also have a special love of young adult like science fiction and fantasy. But one of my favorite authors is Mindy McGinnis, who wrote, The Female of the Species, and, a whole bunch of other books as well. And so I kind of like screamed a little bit when I realized that, like on Amazon, Prepped is, people who buy my book were also buying Mindy McGinnis's release. And there were a few times that we appeared side by side on tables in bookstores, and that to me was just very surreal, because here's an author, who I just love, and now our books are side by side. So that was really interesting and kind of rewarding for me to see someone that I really admire and whose work I really enjoy so close to, my work.
Yeah, I would be the same way. It's just seeing your name next to someone who you've admired, or seeing your book next to their book. That would be a total nerd moment for me. I can completely relate to that. And I know you have a website, so if you can tell people what the website is and where they can find you on social media.
Sure. So my website is just bethanymangle.com, and all of my social media, so my Instagram handle, Twitter, etc., is just Bethany Mangle, so my first name and last name, because I'm not creative when it comes to things like that.
No, but that's easy. I mean, sometimes I think if you get too creative, people can't figure out all your handles. So,
that's true.
Keep it simple. Bethany, we've talked about the book and writing. Is there anything, though, that we haven't covered that you were hoping to bring up, whether it's about preps in particular or about writing in general? Anything we haven't covered?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm just really excited to have a chance to, talk about the book, and then also just talk about, kind of my weird, chaotic writing process and how everything came together, because I'm still kind of shocked that it happened. It's really been a dream come true.
But see, that's why I like that question about, or that hearing how writers write, because somebody is out there thinking, wow, that's how I write. And it worked for her, so it can work for me.
Right. Absolutely.
Yes. So thank you so much for taking the time to join me. I enjoyed our conversation, and I really, really like the book. It's great.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you again to Bethany for talking to me about Prepped. I so enjoyed this book. It sucked me right in. I was rooting for Becca. I was rooting for Becca and Roy as a couple. And I'm not going to tell you how the book ends, obviously, because that would just be rude. You know me and my love of an epilogue, and I would have loved a very extensive epilogue for this book. I'm not mad at the way it ended. I'm not, but you know me, I love an epilogue. And it just made me think that scene in The Princess Bride where Inigo and the Man in Black are having their epic sword fight, and Inigo says, he wants to know who the Man in Black is, and he says, I must know, and the Man in Black says, get used to disappointment. That's how I feel about epilogues. I would say to the author or the lack of an epilogue, and I would say, I must know, and the book would say, get used to disappointment, and I would just have to shrug and continue my epic sword fight with that book. I love epilogues. At any rate, I'm not going to tell you how it ends, but I would have been happy with an epilogue. That's all I have to say about that. If you're a fan of young adult, if you are intrigued by what it might be like to grow up in a prepper community, in a doomsday community, if you're intrigued by what it might be like to grow up with a bunker in your backyard and contingency plans for just about anything, you should definitely check out this book. Even if you're not intrigued by some of that stuff, but you are a fan of young adult comedy, romance, etc., then you should definitely check out Prepped by Bethany Mangle. It's a very fun read. If you are a fan of this podcast, here's my weekly spiel. Please, please, please follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I would love to hear your comments, your thoughts, what you're reading, etc. And if you could take a moment to give us a review, whether written or starred, on whatever platform you listen to the podcast on, I would greatly, greatly appreciate it. Just as much as I greatly appreciate all of you. I hope that you will join me next time for the next, wow, let me back that up. I hope you'll join me for the next interview when I will be speaking with brothers, mother-daughter author team. Now I have brothers for an author team, Ehsan Ahmad and Shakil Ahmad, and I apologize to both of them in advance if I mispronounce their names. I will get those pronunciations during that interview, but we'll be talking about their book Unbound. It is book 2 in their Wild Sun series, and this is science fiction. So we're moving from we've had historical fantasy, we've had urban fantasy. We took a break for some. There was science in Prepped. That could have been science fiction, right? A science fair, at least science fair fiction. I'll stop. Science fiction. Unbound. Join me for that interview. I hope you're having a great day. I'm going to stop while I'm not really ahead, but take some time to get yourself lost in a good book, please. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.